Today we have Matthew Barnes and Andy Deines from the University of Notre Dame, who will be speaking on the topic of exploring consumption as a strategy for managing invasive species. Matthew Barnes is an aquatic ecologist at the University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on predicting the distributions of invasive species and improving species detection through the application of environmental DNA surveillance. Mr. Deines is also an aquatic ecologist from the University of Notre Dame, where he studies the ecological and social impacts of invasive species. Much of his work has focused on the global introduction of tilapia species, and particularly the impacts of the Nile tilapia introduction in Zambia. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. This is Matt, and I'm going to start the presentation today, and then I'll hand things over to Andy. And it's really a pleasure to get to talk to you guys today about the exciting and often controversial topic of consumption as a management strategy for invasive species. And I think it's important to note right off the bat,
unmute your line, press *6 or #6.
Blindly advocate for consuming invasive species, and we'll point out through the talk, there's a lot that we don't yet know. But instead, what we're going to present today is the way that we've been thinking about this issue, and we want to get some reactions to that. If you don't think that we're thinking about this topic the right way, we really look forward to hearing your opinions. And then also, if I could start with a shameless plug, Andy and I are chairing a session on harvesting invasive species at the 2013 IAGLR meeting, International Association for Great Lakes Research. And if anyone is particularly inspired or interested in talking about this topic, we'd love to have some abstract submissions for that session. But so to introduce ourselves a little bit, Andy and I are both grad students at Notre Dame studying invasion ecology, and we've both been active in a National Science Foundation IGRT called GLOBES. And one aspect of that program is that each student or groups of students have had to develop an education or outreach program or other effort to apply our knowledge in a real-world setting. And to that end, we put together the blog invasivore.org as an outreach tool to promote invasive species education and awareness. And we use recipes when we were setting the blog up as sort of a gimmick to catch people's attention, but just coincidentally our website launch occurred during the growth of a more at-large movement proposing to eat invasive species as a management strategy. And it's worth noting before we get into the details here that the blog and then all the information that we'll talk about today really are the results of collaborations with a bunch of people here at Notre Dame, including current graduate students Laura Greenison, Rachel Hesselink, and Shenna Sim, as well as biology alumnus Sean Hoban and economics alumnus Adam B. And before we move on to sort of the main course of our presentation, it might be useful to start with an appetizer about biological invasions in general. I think it's useful to think of invasion as a stepwise process, and there are different management actions that target different steps in that process. Harvest of invasive species is most often considered for its effects at the final stage of that process, the reducing established populations. But one of the things we're going to argue today is that when accompanied by an education or awareness campaign, invasive species harvest can actually benefit stages throughout the invasion process. So here's our menu for today's talk. We're going to start by providing an overview of some of the ongoing experiments in eating invasive species, and then we're going to talk about some of the risks and benefits of harvest as a management strategy, and we'll conclude by outlining some of the important questions moving forward. If this seems like kind of a backwards way to organize the talk to you, that's because it is. As scientists, we usually like to pose our questions and hypotheses first and then conduct the experiments. But the reality is that the real-world experiments have already begun, and we're already find ourselves in a position of having to react. But let's begin with some examples that are currently being employed. So NOAA is leading the Eat Lionfish campaign to combat Indo-Pacific lionfish throughout their invaded range on the east coast of the United States and through the Caribbean. And lionfish, of course, threaten reef communities through voracious predation, and they also represent a human health concern due to their venomous spines. Now, in terms of the success of the program, demand for lionfish appears to have grown by highlighting its invasive status and the negative impacts on local ecosystems and recreation. And if that's the case, then education and awareness that's accompanied the Eat Lionfish campaign should also help prevent further transport and release of the species, which could be considered a success. However, some of the literature, like a 2011 biological invasions paper by Morris et al., estimated that you'd have to harvest 27% of the population a month to result in population decreases. So the success of the program in terms of actually reducing the populations of lionfish is a little more dubious. Another group of invasive fish generating a lot of interest from invasivores are Asian carps. And Gargi et al. Estimated that the Asian carp population in the Illinois River represent a whopping 3 million tons or more per year in total biomass production. And then there's a real concern that establishment in the Great Lakes would devastate the $4 billion commercial and recreational fisheries there. Luckily, according to FAO data, the global market for Asian carp is extensive, and Asian carp represents the single largest aquaculture production sector according to the 2010 data, though the interest from customers in the U.S. seems considerably more limited. So Illinois has looked elsewhere, negotiating the sale of over 22,000 tons of Asian carp to China, and that's got a value of about $20 million and created 180 jobs to boot. Illinois is also promoting the use of Asian carp to feed needy families in their Target Hunger Now campaign. And then there are a lot of other sources of information about eating invasive species. And in 2011, for example, the Food and Water Watch included invasive species on their Smart Seafood Guide for the first time. And even though all the examples so far have been freshwater or have been aquatic organisms, but eating invasive species isn't just limited to fish, of course, and resources for other taxa include cookbooks, like things dedicated to iguanas, as well as hunting guides dedicated to feral pigs and other invasive species, and then websites like our own invasivore.org and eattheinvaders.org also provide a lot of information about collecting and consuming invasive species. And we're happy to report that so far all of the materials that we've encountered have really at least attempted to educate their audiences as well as feed them. Now, the examples that we've shown so far, and really the talk has focused primarily on eating invasive species, but harvest occurs or has been proposed for a variety of other uses, including biofuel, fertilizer, furs, recreational hunting, timber, and then all sorts of other uses. And then this table here shows the number of taxa used for each of several categories based on a literature and internet search that we conducted while preparing a book chapter that's currently under revision. Now, returning to our main menu here, the next entree that we're going to talk about is the perception of risk and benefit associated with a management strategy of promoting consumption of invasive species. Population reduction represents one of the most heralded benefits of consumption because reducing populations could lead to reduced environmental impact and also reduced cost of otherwise managing those populations. Another potential benefit of consuming invasive species is the direct benefit, like a good or a service gained from the act of consuming that species. And then the profits gained from harvest of invasive species can also help recoup the losses incurred by the presence of that species in the first place. Driven by their stomachs and the profit motive, we also think that potential invasive species consumers might also act as volunteers in species surveillance and de facto responders to the discovery of a new invasive population. And importantly, even in cases such as the lionfish example where I gave you, that eradication is unlikely, another benefit of consumption as a management tool is that the opportunities created for education and awareness campaigns. And these campaigns might not only benefit efforts to identify and control one specific existing population, but they also, increased awareness can also promote attitudes and behaviors that would limit other species introductions. Of course, there's also opportunity for unintended consequences of an invasivore management strategy. Unintended consequences may exist, such as generation of economic incentives to spread species into new habitats. And a particular concern is the fact that the profit motive could actually be abused to forego prevention and eradication efforts during the early stages of an invasion when they might otherwise be successful, which is something that we really have to take into account. Additionally, messages that seem to promote invasive species by praising consumption could be confusing to audiences by conflicting with other management campaigns that are more designed to vilify or stigmatize invaders. But where invasive populations and their negative impacts have already securely established, adaptation really demands making the best out of an already bad situation. You might say, when lemons invade, make invasive lemonade. So now I'd like to pass the presentation over to Andy, and he's going to delve a little deeper into some of the economic models that we've been developing and thinking about these ideas.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Bit awkward switch here, but we'll try and keep things going on our gastrointestinal or culinary theme. So the next item on the menu we really want to talk about are the important questions that are remaining as we progress thinking about harvesting invasive species. And obviously there's many questions and concerns that are still lingering out there, and one of the things we're trying to do is develop a conceptual model which we can use to start organizing and developing questions and hypotheses that we can then start to think about and test in a more comprehensive and scientific method type of way. And so to start this, we're beginning to develop a bioeconomic framework to better link declines in populations, declines in invasive populations, impacts on ecosystem services, and the economic forces and explore how much ecosystem impact reduction could be achieved by market-driven harvests of invasive species. So I'll talk about the bioeconomic framework in a little bit more detail, just to give you an idea of where we're going with it, and hopefully how we can think about this stuff in the future. So the first part of the framework is understanding the effect of harvest effort on invasive species population size or density. The second part is the relationship between invasive population density and declines or improvements in valued ecosystem services. And then thirdly is being able to compare the demand for invasive species products and demand for improved ecosystem services to determine how much ecosystem improvement could come from economic equilibrium types of harvests. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these now. So here, the first part at the top that we've highlighted, in the most simplified cases, invasive populations and their densities decline with increasing harvesting effort, which is just shown in that graph. But general questions really remain about how specific populations, species, and different types of harvest will respond to harvest on the ground. luckily, this is really the best understood, or at least the most researched component of the framework, and we really only need to look at a very long history of research from fisheries management and forestry management to get a better idea of how populations respond to harvest. And just another blatant plug for some work we're doing on this issue, or I've done for the Kafuri River in Zambia. But so while the theoretical work is quite advanced on this front of understanding how populations respond, well-studied examples are plentiful. In many of the applied situations that we're starting to be concerned about, there remains a dramatic deficit of the actual data we'd need to understand the models and predict the types of responses we'd actually expect in a specific occurrence. And a lot of basic field biology and field work is still remaining on this front. So the second aspect is a density impact curve. This is conceptually the same thing as a dose-response curve for toxicology or medicine. And the one I've brought up here is just one of a wide variety of potential curves that describe the improvement in ecosystem services with increasing harvesting effort, or alternatively decreasing invasive population sizes. And the general question that remains then is, how do population sizes or densities relate to impacts on ecosystem services that are of value to the general public or particular ecosystem functions? So again, there is some advanced theoretical thinking that goes into this, like optimal foraging theory, interspecific competition, can all be components of this type of impact reduction function. And they're pretty well studied. But in most cases, there's little data that range from across the spectrum of population densities, which is what we're really interested in to understand the form of the curve. There's interactions, say, at no invasive species population or very low populations, and there's information at very high populations, but not much in between to tell us what the shape of this function actually is. And then moreover, like the ideal situation would be that this impact curve also describes the impacts to ecosystem services in monetary terms, so we can start thinking about these in a more economic sense to understand the drivers. But converting from even well-understood impacts on ecosystem services and species into some sort of value is very difficult and still very controversial in most cases. So probably the place to start in understanding these is just well-informed simulation models that include a wide variety of parameters or potential theoretical or even idealized ecosystem values. But hopefully, as we dig deeper into what this framework is telling us, we'll be able to ask those questions more specifically. And then the last part of this framework is transforming this impact curve that I was talking about into a demand curve for ecosystem services. That is, a demand for improved ecosystem services as invasive populations decline due to harvest. And then comparing that curve with the demand for products made out of invasive species. So I've plotted those demand curves here in a more typical microeconomic supply demand sort of framework, where the dashed line is the social benefit received from improved ecosystem services, and then the red line is the demand for invasive species products. And so the first thing this allows us to do is think about this in a microeconomic sense, is to determine the level of effort that is provided just by the market, or the red line here, of invasive species product. And this is that's at point A, that intersection of the red line and the blue line is the amount of effort the market supplies for harvesting invasive species. And so the amount that's supplied, I've indicated just in that dark gray shaded area, and it can be large or small, but one of the take homes here is that there will always be an unsupplied amount of demand for improved ecosystem services, which is represented as the hashed area. And we can play around with different types of supply curves and demand curves for both the population itself, the ecosystem impacts, and the type of product that's actually being formed of these, to to try and optimize the relationship between what is supplied in the gray area and what remains unsupplied in the hashed area. But really, that hashed area will always exist, we think. In most cases, it's going to exist. And so the real take-home, one of the take-home messages from this bioeconomic framework is harvesting invasive species purely based on market forces is not going to be a silver bullet for eradicating a species. It's highly unlikely that it's going to get there. And this really brings up the final consideration that we really want to talk about and end our discussion and start inviting people to comment. And that is these market-based risks of unintended consequences. So the profit motive that's derived from harvesting invasive species does provide incentives, clear incentives, to maintain high populations because profits are higher when the population being harvested is greater, or alternatively to create new populations would spread the invasion further. And so one of the first things our bioeconomic framework is revealing is the core assumption of open access or tragedy of the commons for targeted invasive species populations. And the quintessential example of tragedy of the commons is this overgrazing of common pasture lands, just for reference. But under this assumption of open access, there are strong incentives to overharvest a population, potentially to extinction. And that's one of the motivating factors of harvesting invasive species. However, the unintended consequences forms because profits that are higher from higher density populations create incentives for limiting access to the harvest. So the risk of spread is really a reverse open access type of problem. And it's moving species into new locations that allow access restriction or the elimination of open access to happen. So the risk of spread is just a function of lack of open access. For example, if you move a species onto your own property, you're done, essentially, eliminating open access because no one else has access to your property to harvest that invasive species. But that doesn't mean the invasive species can't spread out from there and cause additional harm. Or if you move a species even into a public water body, some fish species, for example, because you're the one who moved it, you have essentially created yourself first dibs on that new population to harvest and potentially higher profits. So this kind of reverse open access problem is we think one of the leading sources of risk of unintended spread and unintended consequences. And knowing that the source of this incentive can give us some clues about those risks and what to do about it. And so we can start thinking about how important it is to keep access as open as possible to the target populations that we want to reduce so that harvesters inflict the tragedy of the commons, so to speak. But then at the same time, limiting access of new populations or suspected intentionally spread populations access to the market so that there's no incentive to create new populations because those new populations would be valueless without some sort of program to certify it. And then attached to this requires a slight shift in the concept of what the null hypothesis is, or what we compare the risk of additional spread from harvesting invasive species to. And it's important that we consider that the risk of spread due to market incentives should be compared relative to the spread that would be occurring without the market and without the market in place. And the very definition of invasive species suggests that without the market, spread rates are non-zero, essentially, or very high in and of themselves. That is, Asian carp were spreading quite rapidly well before the state of Illinois decided to harvest and market them out of the Illinois River. And so what this means is sort of counterintuitively that species with high background spread rates without the market may actually be less overall risky when you implement a market on top of them. And so, the point of this is just understanding the bioeconomic framework can help us identify where risk comes from and what we can do about it. And those were just a couple examples we've thought about. And lastly, it's worth emphasizing the importance of awareness and keeping the coupling between the reason you're harvesting invasive species to reduce their populations and the pure profit motive. So last, we'll just we'll open up here for a second, in just a second. But just to bring it on back, I guess this is our dessert by our theme. So the cost of invasions are mounting. Invasions are incurring, and we're paying the cost for it now. And so this just means consumption or doing something with the species that are there deserves some sort of consideration as a management strategy, as a form of adaptation to the species that are already present. And we know that consumption has benefits and pitfalls, but we're starting to outline a way to navigate our way through what the benefits are and in order to avoid the pitfalls that loom if we're not careful. And then the real thing is that regardless of what we think or the economic models we're talking about or the ecology, the experiments in harvesting invasive species as part of management have already begun. The lionfish, the Asian carp, lots of books. And it's important for the scientific research and management communities. Once again, we're a little bit left playing catch up, but it has to be done. And so before we open up to proposals, we're just going to plug again. If we've raised your heckles or you're interested or you really got something to say about this, we welcome abstract submissions to the upcoming Great Lakes research session we have. And with that, I think we'll open it up for questions, and we're excited to hear.